America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, shaped by the voices of the everyday man, the man who challenged the way this gosh darn amazing country is run, what it stands for, and where it's heading. That man is the protester. While protests have changed and evolved, there are certain fundamentals that have persisted throughout time, from the first protest in the colonies to the many protests following the most recent election. In this documentary, we will be discussing the common threads that run through protests led by American citizens against their government in the colonial era, the women's suffrage era, the civil rights era, and present day. These commonalities include marches on government buildings, violence, large demonstrations, new groups formed, and public reactions from the government they were protesting. While the actions of the United States' newest president have had some negative effects on America's social climate, there is one good outcome of the election, and that is the rise of more people standing up for their rights through protests. While many protests have been for different reasons, including women's rights, Trump's immigration policy, opposition to Trump himself, the overall consensus among protesters is that they are unhappy with their president and his political ideology. One of the biggest protests was the Women's March on January 22nd, a day after Trump's inauguration. Women marched all across the country, but the main protest was held in Washington, D.C., in front of the White House. This march was organized by a group called Women's March on Washington, one of many organizations that have come to light since Trump's election. Their statement says, "We believe all issues are women's issues." It goes on to state their belief that harmful executive actions will be taken under the Trump administration, and that it will try to divide the people of America, but that they won't let this happen. The statement finishes with the declaration that they are all one, and that the Women's March on Washington is to stand up for their rights and to stand in solidarity with one another. Women are not the only ones who are supporting Trump. According to a news article by USA Today, protests occurred in at least 10 cities across America, all opposing the Trump administration immediately following the election on November 8, 2016. The activists at these demonstrations chanted things such as "No Racist USA," "Nasty Women Fight Back," and "White Males for Equality for All." There's plenty of evidence that shows how this kind of civil unrest is on the rise all over America following the election, and the resurrection of political protests. While most protests are in the name of peace, violence has broken out at many anti-Trump marches and demonstrations. On April 16th in downtown Berkeley, protesters who had gathered for an anti-Trump rally were met by Trump supporters who wanted to counter their protests. It wasn't long before the two groups began to fight, and 21 people were arrested and 11 injured. Even though this was an isolated incident and is not common at Trump protests, it shows the quick downturn that what is supposed to be a peaceful protest can take. Aside from the incident at Berkeley, the protests have been met with positive reactions and brought numerous issues to light. Along with the great success that these marches have had, Democrats found a different way to protest. Protesters, both young and old, made social media one of their most useful and effective resources. Starting after the election in November, anti-Trump protesters took to Twitter to show their outrage, and the now infamous hashtag #NotMyPresident came out and flooded social media for weeks. This alternative use of protesting brought more attention to the outrage against the president-elect and attracted more followers to the anti-Trump movement. And how did the president react to all this, you ask? On February 3rd, Donald Trump tweeted, "Professional anarchists, thugs, and paid protesters are proving the point of millions of people who voted to make America great again." I guess he had his own theories about the protests. But these kinds of protests did not start in the 21st century. Nay, they were a driving force behind what created America itself. Dating back to the 18th century, colonists began to first protest against their governing powers. The Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts of 1767 sparked outrage and fueled protest in the colonies. Because of these injustices that many colonists felt were happening, anti-British organizations and groups emerged. Two of the biggest groups were the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. The two groups formed in response to the Stamp Act. They used various forms of protesting and intimidation to bring an end to British tyranny. The Sons of Liberty took to ransacking British officials' houses and threatening tax collectors, while the Daughters of Liberty made homespun clothing so that the colonies didn't have to rely on British goods. The work of these groups ultimately played a role in the genesis of the Revolution and the colonists' ultimate victory. The colonists also took to other means of resisting Great Britain's power over them. One of the most famous examples of this is the Boston Tea Party. It began when the colonies started boycotting British goods, as shown in this letter written by John Andrews. Many colonists felt that by boycotting British goods, they could end the growing threat that Britain was posing. This increased the tension between the colonies and Great Britain and culminated the colonists' attack on an East India ship that was transporting tea. A group of anti-British activists dressed as Native Americans boarded the ship at night and threw all of the tea overboard. While the revolutionists' goal was to make a statement that Great Britain could no longer enforce their power over the colonies, they instead hurt their cause more than helped it. Many colonists found their actions to be extreme, and some distanced themselves from the pro-independence stance that the demonstrators had. It also led to Great Britain enacting the Intolerable Acts, a series of laws that demonstrated their power over the colonies. The acts included closing Boston's port until the tea was paid for, ridding Boston of its assembly, and other rules that many colonists didn't like. Another conflict between Britain and the colonists occurred on March 5, 1770, and resulted in the death of 5 men. This event was the Boston Massacre, which occurred in front of the Customs House, a government building. On March 12th, the Boston Gazette released a detailed article on the events of the massacre. There was a group of British guards outside of the building who were there to enforce what colonists felt were unfavorable taxation laws. Both the building and the guards protecting it represented Britain's intrusion on the colonists' way of life. A group of colonists began to cluster around the guards, taunting and throwing things at them as an unorganized way of protesting. The British guards began to get angered, which spurred the colonists on until the guards fired into the crowd, instantly killing 3 men and fatally wounding 2 others. This incident reflects the violence that ensued from colonists protesting and challenging the way Great Britain was trying to rule them. Decades after the colonists' fight for independence, the women's suffrage movement emerged through similar methods of protest. Women's rights have been fought for as long as America has stood, but it wasn't until 1848 that the movement truly took form. In 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized a convention in Seneca Falls, New York, which was the first ever women's rights convention. The event advertised itself as a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious conditions and women's rights. This was the first move towards women's rights, and the activism didn't stop there. Many other women's rights organizations were established to fight for the cause. The most notable were the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, the National Women's Party, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In the early 20th century, these women's rights groups and activists fought for women's suffrage by using similar protest methods, such as marches and petitions that had been and would be used time and time again throughout America's history. One of the biggest protests of this era was the Women's March on Washington. In this protest, women as well as men took to the streets the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. Many immigrants took part in this march and were large supporters of the women's suffrage movement, because the same organizations that were fighting for women's equal rights had also fought for the rights of immigrants. In what was meant to be a peaceful protest, violence broke out. The marchers were met by people who felt that women didn't deserve the right to vote. With the clash of these two groups, violence followed, and soon the police came and arrested multiple activists. One activist in particular was Alice Paul. Alice Paul was one of the organizers of the march and is one of the most well-known suffragettes. Here is a picture of her at the Women's March on Washington, holding a sign that compares what Wilson is doing by denying women equal rights to Hitler and the Holocaust. This shows how strongly she felt about her beliefs and about the women's suffrage movement. When imprisoned, Alice Paul went on a hunger strike for her 7-month sentence and had to be force-fed with a tube. This is an example of protesting without marching. Finally, after arguably hundreds of years of women fighting for equal rights through marches, hunger strikes, and petitions, President Woodrow Wilson publicly announced that women would have equal rights, and on June 4, 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in August 1920, giving women the equal voting rights that they so deserved. Not long after the women's suffrage movement, protests erupted throughout America once again, this time in support of civil rights. The civil rights movement was focused on ending racist practices such as literacy tests for voting and segregation in public facilities. One of the most notable and effective protests of this movement was the March on Washington, led by Black rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. The organizers of the march were able to get around 250,000 participants who peacefully marched through Washington, D.C. Once the protesters reached the Washington Monument, Martin Luther King Jr. gave what would become one of the most famous speeches in American history, the I Have a Dream speech. This march and MLK's speech inspired millions of Americans of all races to fight for equal rights, which ultimately led to the integration of all public spaces, the armed forces, and schools by 1964. But the journey for equality was not smooth sailing. Many protests were met with harsh violence. One of the most historic protests to turn violent was the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders were a group of civil rights activists who rode interstate buses into segregated southern states. The mindset of the Freedom Riders was revealed in a 1961 article published in Freedom Ways, where Freedom Rider Jimmy McDonald expressed his feelings about why fighting for civil rights is important, even if people are saying their approach is too aggressive. When the Freedom Riders arrived in Alabama, white supremacists surrounded one of the Freedom Riders' buses, set it afire, and attacked the riders as they exited. The activists regularly faced mob violence, police brutality, and hundreds of Freedom Riders were beaten and jailed. This shows the intensity of racism that still existed in America in the 20th century. Even though the protests were often met with violence, the demonstrators themselves remained peaceful. The sit-in demonstrations of the Civil Rights Movement is a well-known example of the peaceful protests of the time. In February 1960, 4 black college freshmen sat down at a segregated Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and politely asked to be served. They were ignored but remained seated until the counter closed. The following day, more students arrived to take part in the lunch counter demonstrations. The students who participated in the sit-ins were to be well-dressed and behaved, sit peacefully in the whites-only section, and wait to be served. Word began to spread, and more sit-ins took place all over the South. By 1960, around 50,000 students were participating in the movement, despite the dangers that would come from it. The students persisted through the taunts and beatings, and if they were arrested, more students would come to take their place. The lunch counter demonstrations ultimately paid off once the businesses they were targeting began to integrate. Many activists in the civil rights movement felt that MLK's peaceful protests were taking too long to get results, so they turned to a leader with a very different approach, Malcolm X. Malcolm X was the leader of the Black Muslim faith, which took a very different approach to achieving integration. He urged his followers to meet violence with violence if that's what it came to. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965, but his ideas continued to spread through his best-selling book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, which gained popularity among black youth and ultimately led to the creation of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party took a more militant approach to establishing equality. Due in part to the violence that ensued from both activists and anti-civil rights demonstrators, the Kennedy administration decided to propose a bill meant to end discrimination and segregation in jobs and public facilities. This bill was greatly opposed by Southern Congress members, which led civil rights leaders to organize the March on Washington to reinforce their stance on civil rights. Finally, in 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which made discrimination in public places illegal and established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Throughout time, protests have been a forefront for change in the United States of America. In the colonial era, the women's suffrage era, the civil rights era, and present day, protests have shared many key elements in common, including marches on government buildings, violence, large demonstrations, the formation of new activist groups, and public reactions from the governments that they were protesting.